Hello, welcome back to Terms and Conditions, a podcast by Carey. I am your host, Letitia Silas. I am a partner at Carey in their Washington, D.C. office. We are a national labor and employment law firm representing employers in all workplace matters. Today, we are going to discuss a very important and unique skill that could be helpful to you if part of your job is obtaining the stories of others to investigate or better understand workplace culture, workplace concerns, or just workplace relational dynamics. This could also be helpful to those responsible for answering a key question at the heart of every incident, problem, or dispute. What happened? And how did we get here? We are going to discuss trauma-informed interviewing with a particular focus on internal investigations or investigations generally. We are going to cover the relevance and importance of trauma-informed interviewing and why this topic is crucial in today's workplace environment. At the end of this episode, you will better understand why how you show up in internal investigations matters, how openness and a better understanding of the professional, social, and workplace context in which people exist could help build trust and facilitate better communication. You are also going to know why how people are treated in investigations can have a lasting, positive or negative impact on relationships, trust, communication, and overall workplace morale. And finally, you are going to leave this episode with some tools to help you become a better interviewer or investigator. For this discussion, we are joined by Lynn Cripe, CEO of KonTerra Group. She is an expert in trauma-informed interviewing. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited about our conversation today and learning from each other, and hopefully your listeners will also take some things away from our conversation today.
Absolutely. So, Lynn, why don't you tell us more about KonTerra Group and your background?
Sure. So I am co-owner and CEO of the KonTerra Group, and we provide workplace-based mental health and organizational development services primarily to mission-driven organizations and often ones that work in high-stakes and high-stress contexts. And this includes humanitarian assistance, human rights and democracy defense, and trust and safety teams that do online content moderation. And I've been at the KonTerra Group since 2011 in a couple of different roles. And prior to that, had worked both in the nonprofit and the governmental space.
Excellent. You know, this topic is particularly interesting to me because I have spent my entire professional career, even before becoming an attorney, talking to people and understanding their stories with respect to their work as part of my job. And so I am very interested in hearing your experiences and sharing some experiences of my own and helping our audience understand some tools for trauma-informed investigations and interviewing. So why don't you explain to us what exactly is trauma-informed interviewing?
Sure. That might be a phrase that is new to people. People might have heard about trauma-informed care or trauma-informed approaches. It's possible that the idea of trauma-informed interviewing is new. And the way that we like to think about that is that we're simply integrating knowledge and understanding of trauma as well as its effects into the policy and the process of interviewing. Mm-hmm. And so a more colloquial way of understanding that is that it's an additional lens that we bring to interviewing. And so always thinking about how might trauma be playing out in this exchange that we're having at any one time. And it really emphasizes safety, transparency, choice, and empowerment.
So what are the origins of this? Why was this discovered, or how has this become relevant?
Yeah, it's such a great question. We could probably have a whole podcast just on that. But the phrase trauma-informed care first showed up in the literature in 2001, and so just not even 25 years ago, and by Harris and Fallett, which really encouraged practitioners who were interacting with people receiving mental health and substance abuse services to become informed about the dynamics and the aftermath of trauma, because so many people who interact with those services had a trauma history. And their thinking was that if practitioners better understood what trauma looks like, how it shows up in those environments, that they'd be better positioned to serve these clients. And the idea of trauma-informed care really took hold, and you see a rapid increase in models and frameworks around trauma-informed care or trauma-informed approaches. And now you can find discussion of trauma-informed approaches in a whole range of contexts, from education to healthcare to journalism to court systems. And if we think about it, it really makes a lot of sense because of how ubiquitous trauma is. Most of us, sadly, have experienced traumatic events or have some kind of trauma in our background. And particularly in the workplace, the domain that we're talking about, those personal trauma histories are rarely obvious or known. And so when we can bring a trauma-informed lens to our interviewing, it just acknowledges that that history that somebody might be coming in the room with.
Right. So now, is trauma defined the same for everybody, or do people have different thresholds for whatever life experiences or professional experiences that they have had, and maybe what might be traumatic for one person is not as traumatic for another person? Is this, in other words, objective or subjective?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And what we know about trauma is that it is subjective, that for all kinds of reasons, you and I can experience the same event, but might have very, very different reactions to it. And when we think about trauma, we often use trauma, that word, pretty loosely. And for our conversation today, it might be helpful for us to think about trauma as a set of reactions to an event or an experience that is frightening or horrifying. So if you think about that definition, there might be reasons why you and I could have the same experience, and I might think it was frightening and horrifying, but you may not, right? On a smaller scale, we can think about how some people love to fly and other people really don't like to fly. They're having the same experience, but their reaction is entirely different.
You know, Lynn, this is why I love talking to you. When I talk to you, just so much comes up, because my next question then is, well, isn't that really key for attorneys and HR professionals or other professionals to know and understand when they are speaking to individuals about an occurrence, whatever it is, and understanding how that occurrence could impact people differently based on the frame from which they view or experience that occurrence?
Right. Yes. So we are bringing, any of us, right, are bringing a whole set of history, family of origin, prior experiences to any event in the present. And so how we understand an interaction with a supervisor, for example, could be very different based on prior experiences with supervisors. I could have a supervisor, as another example, who physically looks like somebody from my past who harmed me, which might influence how I interpret and how I experience those actions in the present. And all of that is true. And we bring all of that into the interviewing room, so to speak, when an incident has happened that needs to be explored in greater detail. And I'm curious, from your own experience, have you seen examples of that?
100%. Not only in the context of maybe the supervisor resembling someone who was someone who offended the witness in the past, but where the actual interviewer could be resembling some characteristics, some appearance that resembles the prior, I'm going to just say offender through the eyes of the witness, right? And so being cognizant of that is so key. And I have experienced that. And how have I dealt with it? I usually deal with it in, first of all, setting a foundation and a stage where it's not really about me. It's really about the other person, the interviewee. And I have a sincere desire to understand their story, and that I am coming to the conversation with a judgment free attitude. I'm not coming with my preconceived notions. I'm not coming with an attitude of trying to characterize their story or their personality or how they communicate or express themselves. It just is. Those are just facts. What they're saying is just a statement. And so I try to keep it very neutral, and to do that not only through my words, but also through my body language, so that they know they are not speaking to someone who is judging how they are showing up in the conversation.
Yeah, there's so much that I love about what you've just said. You have used the word story, I think 4 or 5 times so far in our conversation, and I think that that is such a helpful frame when we're thinking about interviewing or even investigations. That part of what we're doing is wanting to draw out that person's story and understanding it as fully as possible. And I don't know about you, but even when I hear that word story, like I feel differently in my body than when I hear the word investigation or even interview.
Yeah.
For me, there's sort of a softening that happens, and I feel less guarded about what might transpire if somebody says, "Tell me your story," versus somebody saying, "Okay, I'm going to interview you now about the events that happened last week." Right? Like
Yes.
for me, I can feel the difference physically. And so, one, I love your frame of the story, and then secondly, what you were saying about taking a non-judgmental stance. Everybody's story is their story.
Yeah.
And we don't, even if we have the role of gathering information for a particular purpose,
Yeah.
and even if we might be aligned or hired by one party or another, we can still come into that interaction, it seems to me, with a posture of, I'm not judging your story. I'm
Right.
here to elicit information that's going to be helpful to all parties involved.
Right. And as well, I want to hear from you. I want to understand what happened. Again, going back to how we opened this conversation, is we're trying to get the answer to what happened or how did we get here. Something that I learned very early on in my career, before my lawyer days, my very first interview, where I was interviewing someone, I realized the power and just the symbolism of the notepad and the pencil, and what that means for some people.
Yeah.
For some people, that means, oh, shoot, I'm in trouble. They're going to try to write down every single thing. I better not make a mistake. And so now there's this response of, I have to be extra guarded and careful in every single thing that I say because I might, because I'm nervous, make a misstatement, but they're going to write it down. And so it just adds a layer. I also I learned how this too can be a distraction or a perceived distraction. Mm-hmm. So in that encounter, I was interviewing a witness, and I was listening, and I wanted to hear his story, and it was new, my first time ever interviewing anybody, very excited, but I was also very intent on writing my notes. And he just touched my hand and said, "Stop and listen to me." Mm-hmm. And I have held that in my career for decades now because it was such an important thing to learn very early on in my career, what message that sends when we are so focused on writing down the facts, writing down the story, and that our intention is, yes, to get the story. And even if we're well-intentioned, the person on the other side feels like you're more focused on recording by pen or whatever, computer, what they're saying, than really engaging with them and understanding from their perspective what happened.
Yeah. When you recount that story, what comes up for me is that moment was an invitation to your humanity, right? It was an invitation, well, to actually both your and his humanity, right? Like an invitation from him, please see me, and an invitation to you to connect as two humans, not whatever roles you had at the moment. And most of us want that most of the time.
And creating the space where the individual who did not share, we don't share gender, we didn't share a racial background or cultural background in terms of how culture is generally understood. But he felt the safety to lightly put his hand on my hand. And so at least there was the safety created where he felt there wasn't a barrier there, and I just have to shut down because I can't get through to this person. This person's focused on notes. So I really think understanding our body language, our tone, the tools we bring into the interview, that's all so important.
Yeah. And if I can make one more comment about that, one of the things I'm really appreciating about you sharing that story is that it reminds us that many of us are doing things that are trauma-informed. We're using trauma-informed approaches, even if we don't know it. Yeah. And I think it can be helpful to remind ourselves of that so that it doesn't, hearing about trauma-informed interviewing doesn't feel inaccessible or impossible, because many people are doing things that create safety and choice and empowerment anyways. And that trauma-informed interviewing is a way to perhaps just put a little bit more structure and a little bit more completeness around it.
I love that, structure and completeness. And we may have touched on this already, but I really would like to share with our audience some signs of trauma that they should take into consideration when conducting an interview.
Yeah. So when we think about interviewing, that it can be helpful to think about the impact of trauma on our memory and the impact of trauma on our behavior. Mm-hmm. There are other kinds of impacts of trauma, but for the purposes of this discussion, those might be among the most salient. And so if we think first about memory and how trauma impacts memory, we don't need to get into all the brain science, but suffice it to say that events that can cause us to feel overwhelmed and threatened and powerless, or in other words, traumatic events, those events influence how we make and how we store memories about those events. Okay, and so generally, memory is poor. And so that's one thing to keep in mind, that when people are under stress, when people have experienced traumatic events, just in general, their memory is poor. But then there are some specific ways that we have seen that memory can be affected by the experience of traumatic events. So sometimes there can be the misapprehension that when people have a traumatic event, experience a traumatic event, they have very vivid, very clear memories.
Yes.
And that actually isn't the case.
Yes.
What can be vivid are sensory-based memories. And so it's not uncommon to hear people talk about the smell, the body sensation, a color that they saw, or a particular object that they saw during the event. But those are sensory-based. So for example, I have somebody in my life who has worked on post-bombing responses.
Mm-hmm.
And this person can't tolerate the smell of almonds because it evokes memories of explosive material in other contexts. And so that's an example of a sensory-based memory, right? That smell evokes memory. And so people can have very vivid memories about those kind of snapshots of sensory experiences, but the memory of the entire event may be fragmented or spotty or incomplete. And so if you and I were to talk about what did you do yesterday, right, we would each probably say, well, I got up and then I, had some breakfast, and this is what I had for breakfast, and then it was a holiday, and so we did thus and such as a family, and we would recount that memory or that experience as a chronological story. And what we see with people who have experienced trauma is it can be very, very difficult to recount an event or what happened as a chronological story. And that those details may be recalled in bits and pieces and disclosed over time. And if you think about how that shows up in the interview, right? If you're talking to somebody whose story is kind of all over the place, they don't have clear recollection. Maybe in the first interview, they told you facts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then in interview 2, they tell you facts 6, 7, and 8. What conclusion might you draw?
Well, many, not necessarily me, but many would say this person is not telling the truth.
Right, right. And that could be the case, but there is also the likelihood that this story is coming out that way because of the impact of trauma on their memory.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And do you think that we have a better appreciation for the impact of trauma on memory in the criminal context when we're talking about a criminal or a crime that has been committed against someone versus in the very civil context, or just even not anything having to do with any legal violation or legal claim, but just in the everyday workplace relations context where it's, we expect people to have this sharp memory of things that they believe happened to them. But when it's in the criminal context, we sort of put in a layer of, at least that's my observation, kind of understand that maybe this crime that was committed against this person has had such a traumatic toll on them that maybe that's why the story takes a while to come out or may have different variation.
Yeah. And that's such an intriguing point. And when we think about, a workplace accident or an investigation related to misconduct or even, financial misconduct in an organization, if somebody's investigating that, if we link the two ideas of what you have just put forward, we may not think of those experiences necessarily as traumatic, and so don't bring in this additional information. But we also have to remember that people have their own personal history that they're also bringing to it that we may know nothing about.
Correct.
And which is why I would argue and advocate that bringing a trauma-informed lens to our interviewing is always beneficial, even if it's not something that is overtly traumatic.
I love what you said about the sensory-based memory triggers, because I did learn in my career, we were trained on this early on in my legal career. If someone really is having a difficult time trying to remember what happened, maybe you can start with saying, well, do you remember what day of the week it was? Mm-hmm. Do you remember, was it hot or cold outside? Were you wearing a jacket or did you have on snow boots? Sometimes that can jog the memory some, and they'll say, you know what, I was wearing a jacket that day, I remember. Or you know what, I did have to shovel my car out that day, and therefore it had to be in the morning. Or, do you remember what you ate on that day? Or maybe someone else, a family member that you spoke to on that day about what happened. Oh yeah, I remember I called my mom. Let me look at my phone and see when I called my mom, and that might help me remember the day that happened, and which would then further trigger more memory. So I 100% agree with that, and there are organizations that even train their investigators to call upon those sensory triggers.
Yeah, and that so memory can be unreliable in the best of circumstances, and so those kinds of prompts are helpful in general. And that approach of kind of location and time-based prompts can be especially helpful when you're talking with somebody who might have experienced a traumatic event, and those memories are just stored in their brain differently.
And thank you for using the word prompt. I said trigger. So if we're talking about trauma, maybe we want to stay away from the word trigger. We'll use prompt. Lynn, can you help us understand how the generational shifts in the workplace, or maybe even integration or inclusion efforts in the workplace, may have improved our understanding and response to trauma? In particular, what was the old school way, and what are we seeing more now?
Yeah, so I think it's such a provocative question, because I think we do have some real generational differences, and of course we always have to be careful about generalizations. You can find examples of any members of any group who don't fit that, but there are some different expectations and some different experiences, and our scientific understanding of trauma has really matured over the last 50 years as well, which I think makes for a really interesting intersection in response to your question. And if when you and I started our careers, there was probably no discussion of trauma, right?
Right.
That just get what you need, get the information that you need, and there were standard ways of eliciting that information without much concern. Not necessarily because people were malicious or poorly intended, but this was the way that we did things. And now I think you have not only more understanding of how trauma impacts memory and behavior, you have more understanding of how ubiquitous and common trauma is, and particularly with millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha, that they are much more fluent, tend to be much more fluent in matters of mental health, much more comfortable talking about it, and have very different expectations of their employers and their workplaces because of that, right? And so they expect that there will be, even if they don't use this language, they expect that trauma-informed approaches will be used.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. I was just commenting the other day about how there's so much conversation about these generational differences in the workplace. I just wrote an article about it, and it was in law.com and in the New York Law Journal.
I'd love to see that.
I'll send it to you. And I'm working on another one on bring your whole self to work and what that really means generationally, right? But here's what I think Gen Z, I don't know if I've encountered Gen Alpha in the workplace just yet,
Right.
but Gen Z gets incredibly right, including, I would say, Gen Z adjacent millennials, meaning those who may be in their early 30s or so. They get grace and empathy, right?
Yeah.
Not saying that the earlier generations didn't get it right. It just wasn't the norm. It was collect the facts, read the policy, apply the policy to the facts, or apply the law to the facts. And it really wasn't, there wasn't room, or it wasn't taught to be empathetic, right? Or to extend grace, or to benefit of the doubt. Those were concepts that were not really encouraged or taught. But I think the Gen Z and Gen Z adjacent millennials have really captured that, and they really demand that. And they are, in my observation, more courageous about discussing what they believe to be trauma for them.
Yeah.
And also more self-aware sometimes in how they respond
to
other people in serious circumstances. Now, we've all had the customer service person at the drive-through that just rolls their eyes and looks at us crazy when we want to order, a 4-shot latte. Not talking about that. I'm talking about in serious discussions where something has happened and there's a problem or a real concern. I have observed these individuals, some of them more than others, show up in a way that is far more empathetic, open to listening, and open to extending grace.
Yeah. And it's such a beautiful way of putting it, extending grace, and to think about what that means and what that looks like in the workplace. For me, at least, it just feels expansive and opening up and kinder. And when we all want to work in places that are kinder, work is hard enough.
Well, one of the things that I do here at KonMacio Carey is I train employers in positive employee relations. And that is along those lines. That's in the space of how do you create communicative and positive, healthy employee relations such that your employees feel that they can trust you, that they can come to you, that they can bring their questions or concerns, and that they don't exist in a punitive environment where if they make a mistake, a real sincere mistake, I'm not talking about, flouting the rules and don't care. I'm talking about a real, sincere mistake, that they will be extended some grace and some opportunity to improve, and they will be provided with guidance. They will be provided with mentorship and encouragement, right? And they have less of a need, and this is my subject matter expertise, to go outside of the organization and want a third party to come in and establish those lines for them so that they do feel heard, they do feel respected, and they feel protected.
Right. Yeah. And some of some of the things, so if we're thinking about leaders within an organization and what they can do to facilitate exactly the dynamic that you're talking about, some of those best practices are trauma-informed best practices because they're really about what is going to be best for humans, regardless of experience. And so, we can think about some of the best practices for trauma-informed interviewing. Don't just limit it to those interviews, but these are good practices whenever we're interacting with each other. How can we set up environments that are comfortable and non-threatening? How can we establish a sense of safety? How can we establish a sense of control and predictability within our organizations? Super important in the context of trauma-informed interviewing and good for all of us.
So what does creating a safe environment look like?
So in the context of trauma-informed interviewing, where somebody might be interviewing somebody who has been through a difficult experience, whether it is a workplace accident that is being investigated, whether it's interpersonal misconduct, some of the things that can contribute to a comfortable and non-threatening space include things like, how can the space be set up to attend to people's physical needs during the course of the interview? Is the room warm enough or cool enough? Are there beverages available? Is there Kleenex easily accessible if somebody becomes emotional? How are you thinking about breaks? And do you know where the restrooms are or a break room so that if somebody needs a break, they can easily get to it? Is it quiet? Are you likely to not be interrupted? And then thinking about the seating, where will the interviewee sit? If the interviewee has been through an experience where they felt at jeopardy or unsafe, do they have easy access to a door so that they don't feel trapped in a room? And then giving people choice in where in the room they sit. Those are a few of the things that we can think about in the actual space where the interview takes place.
And I want to add to that, understanding for some, walking to the halls or through the halls of human resources can sometimes have the same effect as when we were kids and we walked through the halls of the principal's office. Because that says, oh shoot, if I'm here, I'm in trouble. I'm already going on the defense. Yeah. So maybe, and not that that's wrong, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, because sometimes a person's feeling of being on the defense is valid. It doesn't make them wrong. It doesn't make anybody else right. It just is. But understanding that, maybe to have this interview, we should meet in the conference room, a small conference room, or a different office location. Maybe if you are a organization that maybe has a library on site, maybe you meet at the library in one of the study rooms, and where you have some quiet and you have some confidentiality. There's also just sort of the awareness of who sees me walking in here, right? And who sees me walking out, right? And then who are they going to go share that information with? The other thing is, you want to think twice about having witnesses or employees go to the attorney's office to give their statement. Because again, I think even in a more heightened sense than going to HR is now going to an actual law office, and you want me to think this person is a neutral? Right. Right, that they're being objective, right? We just have to be aware of those things. So in addition to everything that you've said, I've also seen those iterations in my career, and that's really, really important. If you're going to interview individuals about maybe a complaint about the supervisor, and the interview is happening right next to the supervisor's office or a place where the supervisor frequents, then you have to be aware of the impact that may have on that individual being able to convey their story.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I love all of that, and the what that brings up for me is how important the preparatory stage of any interview is. That you're not only thinking about what you want to accomplish in that interview and the questions and how can you phrase the questions to accomplish your task, which we need to acknowledge interviewers do have a goal that they're trying to accomplish, a job that they need to do, but how to broach the questions and frame the questions and ask the questions in a way that elicits information in as trauma-informed way as possible, but also to think about the preparation of all of that other stuff. Is what is this experience going to be like for the interviewee, from how the space is set up to what the actual space is, who can see, who can hear, what might that mean and convey even unintentionally to the interviewee. I love the thoughtfulness that you're articulating there.
Well, it's all relevant. And so my goal is always to help us understand all the factors that are at play and that we shouldn't take for granted, right? So why don't we dive more into that preparation piece? What are some keys for informing individuals that there is an internal investigation happening and that they might be called to give a statement? That is a question that I get all the time. How do we tell our employees? How do we notify our employees? And let's just suppose we're talking about sometimes some very high-ranking officials who may be very offended at receiving a notification. How could we prepare for that and prepare how we inform individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a couple of principles that we might keep in mind as we're thinking about that is that high ranking, whatever one's rank is, that information and control is important. And so one of the things that we when we're in an organization or consulting with an organization that is having to deliver difficult news of whatever kind that might be, is thinking about providing as much information as we can within the bounds of confidentiality as neutrally as possible, and letting people know what the entire arc of the process is going to look like. And so those are a couple of the principles that I would want to be keeping in mind. And I'm curious, in your work, what have you seen be effective in that same situation?
I think regardless of the person's role in the investigation, the level or amount of information or type of information that is sought from that individual, receiving a letter is going to be jarring, no matter what, no matter who you are, from every level within the organization. If you receive a letter saying that there's an investigation and we want to talk to you, doesn't matter who you are. The first thought is, are they saying I did something? So you want to disarm that, right? You want to communicate that the purpose of the investigation, and maybe there's a way to articulate that purpose in a better sense and more effective sense than our purpose is to determine if you violated the time and attendance policy. Right? Our understanding is that there are some concerns about time and attendance, and we'd like to hear from you what has happened in terms of time and attendance in your department. And, again, without thinking about it much, that's generally
right.
how you might consider framing things. If the letter or the email has an accusatory tone, then that person is going to be less likely to want to participate in the interview. So I think what I do is I try to approach it in a way of I'm collecting information, and I'm not calling balls and strikes here. I want to hear what happened, and then we'll call balls and strikes. But first, we need to understand what happened.
Yeah, and it comes back to what you said at the very beginning in your first or second sentence, I think, as we started out today, is you're wanting to understand the story.
Yeah.
That there has been a report of something related to time and attendance policy and adherence to the time and attendance policy, and you're wanting to understand the story around that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. If you open up the letter or the email with "our policy says," well, guess what that does for not only your interview, but what does that do for your relationship?
Yeah.
Because nobody wants to feel like someone's walking around with a ruler all day, going, I'm gonna be the citation police. I'm gonna issue citations all day. So you just have to be aware of that and try to communicate that your goal, again, is to understand what happened. And another thing that I think it could be effective is if you are able to weave in some of the organization's core values in that communication. If you say, we value teamwork, respect, and being on time for work is part of teamwork and part of respect, because your team members are counting on you to work on time, right? And your supervisor is counting on you, and our customers are counting on us to have employees who are ready to work on time, right? And so if you're able to weave in some of your values into the notification, and I know some folks might be saying, look, Letitia, that's just too flowery and we don't have time. But once you do it, you can just tailor your letters going forward. But at least you have something that makes it more than just a what could be perceived as a just an accusation.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing from you is that it doesn't have to be an extensive paragraph long explanation, but the purpose of this is, and this is important to us because we value XYZ here at KonTerra, or whatever organization it might be.
And we value you, and we want to see you succeed here. And here's how you succeed. I mean, and really mean it, right? Don't just say we want you to succeed, and then all the other actions say something else. So let's go a little bit more into some more techniques here. When we opened up, I said that our audience would understand why how we show up matters. And one technique that I learned early in my career is how we dress. And right, and if you show up to a interview to speak with, let's just say, bakers at a bakery who may work in an industrial bakery, or let's just say individuals responsible for waste collection, and you're wearing a suit, it might set up a barrier there, right? That is going to impact the flow of communication, because they see lawyer or HR person in a suit. But if you show up very intentionally and maybe you have a little more casual appearance, maybe it's business casual on that day, right? Maybe that sends the message, the nonverbal message that, hey, I can relate to you and you can relate to me.
Yeah, yeah. It's so trying to decrease actual or perceived power differentials. And some of the ways that we communicate that, that humans communicate that, is through the way that we dress.
Yes.
And so thinking about how can we put ourselves on more of an equal playing field is what I'm hearing you reference.
Absolutely. That was the training that I got. I also learned about the importance of things that even, listen, people are paying attention.
Mm.
I also negotiate collective bargaining agreements in my career, and people pay attention. So if you roll up in a Bentley to negotiate the contract for people, who are, not at the Bentley pay scale, then you have to be aware that how you showed up could impact those discussions. That's not an interview, but it's still an exchange of information and stories so that you can get a deal.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It just invites thoughtfulness from start to finish, doesn't it? And intentionality, and uh, and things that we can often take for granted or be unintentional around, and not make choices around, is to bring those more into our foregrounded awareness and say, how will it be perceived if I show up wearing a suit versus business casual? Or if I come with my fountain pen that maybe was a graduation gift and so super meaningful to me, but may communicate something unintended to the other party.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about effective communication, and we're coming on time here, but I want to talk about the importance of good communication skills and get your ideas on what are some tools for establishing effective communication.
Yeah, so we've talked about a number already, which I hope people will reference back to. Another tool that we would, or approach that we would talk about in trauma-informed interviewing, has to do with empathy, and how important bringing empathy into the conversation is. And that doesn't mean that you agree with the other person or even endorse their point of view, but thinking about what is the other person experiencing or feeling, and how can I communicate that I understand that. And some of the ways that we do that, one of the ways that we do that, is to recognize courage, that it takes courage to tell this story. It takes courage to recount what you experienced, and I appreciate that. Or I could imagine that this was difficult to share with a stranger, and I appreciate that. So to think about recognizing courage. Other things that we can think about include using open-ended questions. So rather than narrowing the conversation, we want to open it up, right? What are you able to tell me about your experience? Can you tell me more about X, Y, or Z? Help me understand your thoughts when this particular thing happened. What were your reactions to this experience? And can you hear the difference, right? What were your reactions to this experience versus were you angry when that happened?
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
Or did
mm-hmm,
you feel guilty when that happened?
mm-hmm,
Making assumptions about
mm-hmm,
what somebody might be experiencing,
mm-hmm,
or what their reaction might have been at any moment in time, and rather letting them tell that story.
and why they felt that
Right,
way, right?
right.
Did how did you feel? And once they tell you, now why did you feel that way? And you might be thinking they're going to refer back to the other thing, but they might say, well, that day I had gotten into an argument with a family member before I left the house.
Mm.
So I was already feeling a little on edge.
Yeah.
So when I had the conversation with my boss, I was already sort of frazzled,
Right.
and this is how I received it because of another event, unrelated, had occurred. So, asking the why could be effective too.
Yes, yeah, I completely agree. And that is often quite important, isn't it, to understand the intent um, underlying any interaction.
Okay, well, Lynn, we are close. I want to close out with just finally some steps for integrating trauma informed approaches. And we've talked about a lot of them during this hour. But could you just share with us some steps that employers, HR professionals, others can start thinking about today?
Yeah. So there are 3 steps that I would offer for people to consider. If you're thinking, oh, yeah, we could really do more in my organization, in my firm around this, the first thing I would say is find your allies. Who else in the organization has a vested interest in improving the quality of your interviewing? And I don't think we've said this explicitly yet in our conversation, Letitia, but the reason we talk about trauma-informed interviewing is not to be nice, though it is a good thing to do, it is a kind thing to do, but it's because it actually helps interviews be more effective. And so who else has a vested interest in strengthening your approaches to interviewing or investigations and come together? Because it's very difficult to make any movement individually. So that's the first thing, is find your allies. The second thing I would say is there are probably already things that you're doing in your protocols and your policies that are trauma informed. And so do an audit and figure out what you're already doing that can be built upon. And then thirdly, consider investing in some training in trauma-informed interviewing for those people in your organization or your firm who might benefit from this additional skill set to strengthen their interviewing or the investigative abilities.
I love it. And with that, we are at time, and we want to thank everyone for joining us again on Terms and Conditions, a podcast by KonTerra Group, where we demystify workplace laws in a grounded and accessible way to help you be an employer of choice. We were joined today by Lynn Cripe, CEO of KonTerra Group, and she was helping us understand the importance of trauma-informed interviewing in internal investigations. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy.
Absolutely. And remember, you can follow us on all platforms where you get your podcasts, including Apple and Spotify. We're here to help you stay ready so you don't have to get ready.